Hi, I'm Jessica Smith. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Politics and International Relations at Southampton, and I want to give you a taster lecture on gender and political leadership, concentrating especially on how that's playing out in times of coronavirus. So you might have seen this story in the press that's been going around that female leaders are doing better at handling the crisis than male leaders, especially around Jacinda Ardern, the New Zealand Prime Minister. So I want to ask, is this really true? As political scientists, we'll train you to be critical and skeptical, and you'll be able to take these claims and unpack them. Is what the media is saying really the case? So at the moment, what do we know about gender and leadership in a crisis? Well, mainly what we know, mainly from the US context, is that voters actually prefer male-style leadership in a crisis. So we have these stereotypically male traits like tough, assertive, decisive, and we see support for those traits go up in times of economic or security crisis. We also see that support for a female leader goes down. So for example, after September 11th in the US, it was found that support for a female presidential candidate went down. We also see this idea that maybe women will be in power more during crises because there's this idea of a glass cliff that women are put into leadership during difficult times. It's summed up in this phrase, think crisis, think female. But actually what that is the concept that maybe female leaders are put in to kind of steer the sinking ship and then they get rid of when things get better. So basically they're put in to put it flippantly, just to make everyone feel great whilst the ship goes down, which I think that quote there sums up really nicely. So the suggestion isn't necessarily that we do want female leaders in a crisis. But are women maybe doing better at handling the COVID crisis? Well, actually, the differences might be more based around party than sex when we look at the US case. So in the US, we've seen governors and mayors step in to fill the gap where the president isn't necessarily making policy, also due to the federal system. And actually what seems to differentiate how those mayors and governors are handling the crisis is more dependent on if they're Democrat or Republican than dependent on the sex of that leader. In terms of globally, actually what might be seeming that women are doing better is actually it's the places that women are in power at the moment matters. So although across time we've had female leadership in democratic and undemocratic countries, in rich and poor countries, at the moment it seems that women are particularly in power in democratic countries with high levels of institutional trust and bureaucratic capability. So these are the kind of places that maybe will be better at handling this crisis to start with. This idea then that maybe women leaders are doing better could also be an example of the double standards that are often applied to women in politics. So we know that women win elections at the same rate as men, but actually there's this idea that maybe there's a performance premium on women, that they have to be more qualified and more competent in order to win elections. And the evidence suggests that they often are. The idea also that women do politics differently is an idea that's sometimes used to argue for more women in politics. And although there is evidence that women differ in their legislative styles, they focus on different policy issues, arguing that they will do politics differently can perpetrate damaging stereotypes about women and place additional burdens on them as representatives that aren't there for their male counterparts. But I think there's some interesting questions to ask around gender and leadership in times of coronavirus. So what we know about what is preferred in leadership in times of crisis is often around security threats, i.e. terrorism, or economic crisis. Whereas COVID is obviously partly economic, but also mainly around health, which is a traditionally female policy area. So it may be a time where we associate more with female styles of leadership. It's also a crisis that's very much kind of coming into our homes, and we're seeing politicians in their own homes more. So it's breaking down that public-private divide that feminism began to break down in its early days. It might be, therefore, that voters might want a more kind of feminine style of protection. Or alternatively, or in addition, we might see the same kind of policies or policies varying more on partisanship, but the style in which these policies are presented might change according to the sex of the leader. So we've seen things like Jacinda Ardern doing a Facebook Live question from her sofa, having just put her toddler to bed, in contrast with seeing Boris Johnson, still in a very institutional, formal environment doing his briefings. So we might see different styles depending on the sex of the leader. So there are still a lot of questions that coronavirus raises about political leadership, and some of these could be ones you could answer at Southampton. So what leadership traits do the public value in times of crisis? And maybe this differs depending on the type of crisis. Maybe rhetoric that leaders are using changes according to the sex of that leader. Maybe that's also related to their partisanship. Maybe we do expect more from female leaders. Does that change in times of crisis in particular? Is it the media? Are they treating male and female politicians differently? Have they got different expectations of leadership from male and female leaders? And how does this maybe affect support for lockdown measures? Are people more likely to obey or support lockdown measures if they're presented by a male leader or a female leader, or a male expert or a female expert? So these are some of the questions that we can ask, and it'd be great to see you at Southampton to help me answer them.